Okay, everybody, good morning. Now, we've concentrated to a great extent on the country of Germany, and today we're moving across to France into the end of the 19th century, into the world of Alfred Dreyfus. Now, the number of books written on Dreyfus exceeds all other books in France except for those dealing with the French Revolution. And there are books written on every aspect of Dreyfus, from his life to the trial, which you know about, to his life on the island, which is portrayed in many ways in films, to his life afterwards, what happened to the family. And there is an enormous amount of material which I will be dealing with over more than 1 week. It's too large a subject for just 1 week, so we'll continue on next week. And I would like to look at it a slightly different way, is to deal with the background of French Jewry at the period we're dealing with and slightly earlier, and how Dreyfus was created, as it were, because there are books which actually state, and there's one, the title of one, which is something like Dreyfus without Dreyfus, that his personality was such that if we even never had Alfred Dreyfus, the affair could have taken place in some way, that his personality was such that it really didn't add very much to the story of this particular incident and this affair, which would become a worldwide affair. Now, the Dreyfus family starts in Rixheim, which is, if you've been to Alsace, it's part of Alsace-Lorraine, and the grandfather, was an Abraham Isaac Dreyfus, and Dreyfus was spelled Dreyfus. This is the name of the family with a double F, showing its Germanic roots. And they lived in Rixheim, which was a small village, which was of 1,500 people, where there were about 200 Jews. And they had gone back all the way to when the Jews were settling in Italy, and they moved up from Italy to this area, particularly beautiful area of the world of Alsace-Lorraine, one of the most contentious, the most fought over areas of Europe. Now, the name Dreyfus is based, and it's similar to anybody who is known as Treves as well, which we do find in rabbinic literature, the name Treves, and it probably comes from Trier, Trier, and it gave linguistically to Dreyfus, 3 foot, and that is the origin of the name. Now, Dreyfus lived in an area of Rixheim, which was between the Vosges Mountains and the Rhine. And because of geographical location, that is why this area became so important. This is one of the areas which is contended by Germany on the one side, to the east, and France to the west. And it fell into French control after the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, and there was never a specific, when the Jews were living in Alsace, there was never a specific ghetto or anything like that. The Jews lived among everybody else. There weren't that many of them. Now, Abraham, the man we start with, the beginning of the family, was a shochet and a butcher, and he did a bit of loaning money, a bit of usury. And this would bring him into this area of contention whereby Jews involved in usury were heavily condemned, as they were prior, and they would be afterwards, wherever it were. And sometimes this usury would lead to not particularly anti-Jewish riots, but would lead to riots for those who objected to usury. And they would often destroy the rioters, would destroy the loans of people that were lending the money. Now, the Jews of Alsace-Lorraine spoke a particular dialect. They neither spoke French particularly well. In fact, it is known that of the people living there, a very small percentage of people actually spoke what we would call classic, the Queen's English, or the Queen's French, or the King's French. And very few spoke it, and not that many spoke a particularly good German. And they spoke a Judean Alsatian dialect. This is common in the Jewish world, where the Jews absorbed a language from among their own people and wherever they lived. Now the son was Jacob, and he had a daughter as well. That is, Abraham had a daughter as well, but the daughter died young. This was very common. The amount of mortality, morbidity, which occurred amongst young children was quite enormous. Now, they lived an isolated life in a small village, but greater events would begin to overwhelm them. Events which they had no effect on, but would affect them. Now, the Jews were just 1%, if that, and probably not even 1% of the general population. But they would agree, even living, as I've said, with a Germanic name in a village which had a Germanic name as well, they saw themselves as patriots of France, and they saw that France was, in their words, their promised land. France, and not, as they said, Palestine. And they would absorb and appreciate and enjoy all the benefits of living under the protection of French law. France often had a particular attraction in the world. We can see that even earlier on, that France was viewed as this ideal country, an ideal country where people would want to live, and people would flock, not just Jews, but others as well, from Eastern Europe and other places, in order to absorb French culture. And French culture, French art, French music, French way of living would be then transported back to whichever country they came from on many occasions, such as the Hermitage being established in Russia. Now, they quoted, as emancipation then came at the end of the 18th century, the Sephardim were first emancipated, and afterwards the Ashkenazim, which was a bit more of a struggle because they were the sort of Jews that the French didn't particularly want or like. And the Alsace Jews were part really of the Ashkenaz, viewed as those of Ashkenaz. And they said, when they were emancipated, the promised land of the Jews will be the place where they finally secure peace and tranquility. What a wonderful land to be in. But it wasn't all perfect. And for those into French history, there was in 1793 what was known as the Reign of Terror. Now, Jacob Dreyfus, the son of the founder of the dynasty, you could say, of Abraham, became a trader and a dealer, and he took whatever his father did and he developed it further. And he too saw himself as an absolute Frenchman in many ways. This was again the promised land. And he was a dealer, and he took what his father had done just a bit further. He advanced the wealth of the family by dealing in land. At that time, the French were way ahead of countries around Europe. They were getting emancipation 100 years before they were in Germany and other places. And they bought, or he bought, small plots of land. And they moved then to Mulhausen. Now, Mulhausen, again, is a small village, town, which has a Germanic name. Now, the Jewish community of Mulhausen was 7%. Now, when you consider that the Jewish community of Paris was probably less than 0.5% of the population, you can see there were quite a lot of Jews there. And the area there was considered the most French city in all of Alsace. So although they had cities, towns, villages with German names, they viewed themselves as French. Now, they had a son called Raphael. Now, Raphael was the son, is where our story really gets going, as it were. Raphael was the son of Jacob, the son of Abraham, and he married Jeanette Liebmann in 1841. Showing their Frenchness, they called their very first son Jacques. So they moved away from having Jewish names, but they ended up with the commonality of calling people, like Charles, a name which suited themselves in that particular country. Raphael saw the modern changes to Mulhausen, and it changed more in his early years of life than that town had changed in the previous 600 years. Now, he took advantage, that is Raphael, the grandson of Abraham, the father of Alfred, he took advantage of advances in technology, and he saw that there were factories and they were producing cotton, wool, and chemicals, and they were beginning to build up a wealthy enterprise. Now, wealth would become an incredibly important aspect of what we will ultimately come to in the affair. Money was important. Now, he involved himself in textile industry. Now, the city became more French and changed its name, although the spelling is Mulhouse, is in fact Mulhouse. And that had been that French name of this Mulhausen since 1798. And at this point, he, Raphael, decided to change the name from Dreyfus, Dreyfus, to be more French, as we know it, Dreyfus, just with one S. They had 9 children, a phenomenal, into her early 40s, she had 9 children. And 2 of them died young, so there were then a family of 9 of them, 7 children and the 2 adults. Now, the last children who were born, were Mathieu, and then October the 9th, 1859, the last child, and the most difficult birth, was one of Alfred. Now, the Germanic background of their family gave rise to a Tower of Babel of sounds in their family, with each one of them speaking with different accents and different acquisitions of the French language, and some speaking more in German than French, others speaking in the Alsace twang, but only Mathieu and Alfred were pure French, and they were the best French speakers, and they spoke proper French. Now, they cultivated the French language and the French literature, and they saw it as their mother tongue, and they spoke it with no accent, remembering that 1/3 of the children in the town where they lived in Mulhausen or Mulhouse were completely illiterate. And efforts were then made to ensure that, quote, the generation now growing up will almost all speak French in the language of their country. Now, the parents of the Dreyfus family wanted Mathieu and Alfred to lead the business forward, which was developing and expanding and becoming extremely successful. And they wanted it to be led into the 20th century. Now, the family moved to a grand home. They lived exceedingly well, and Mathieu would follow into the business. Young Alfred at that moment was still younger, and he was studying hard. By the end of the 1860s, Germany was in ascendancy, and the Mulhouse residents were beginning to be split between those who were looking towards Germany and those who were keeping themselves looking towards France. Alsace-Lorraine is, without question, one of the most fought over and contentious regions in Europe. It is fought over by the Germans, who wanted to expand the German empire, you could say, because of its military position between the Rhine and the Vosges mountains. It had industrial wealth, it had iron ore deposits, it had magnificent cultural ties, and France had declared war in the 200 years that we're speaking, between 1670 and 1870, 2 or 30 times in those 200 years. And they desired a Germany now under Bismarck looked to expand Germany and to attack France. And the French believed that they had an army which would be able to withstand anything which the Germans would throw at them. And that French aggression would deal with the Germans. And from 1792, it is said that they began to sing La Marseillaise. I don't know if you've ever read the words of La Marseillaise, of what people say in their national anthems. So I will read to you just one bit of La Marseillaise, which you've heard beautifully, and it's taken up by the Lubavitch movement as the music of it for one of their nigunim. And it says, "Let's go, children of the fatherland, the day of glory has arrived. Against us Tyrannid blood-stained standard has been raised. Do you hear it in the countryside? Those bloodthirsty soldiers of Blair. They're coming right into your arms to tear the throats out of your sons and your wives. And that is what you sing in La Marseillaise to this very day, I would imagine. Now, France declared war on Germany, 1871, and therefore the French, believing that they would be victorious, was a complete and absolute disaster. The French army was hopeless, and Mulhouse was invaded and cut off from the French interior. Nearly all of Alsace became part of German expansion, German control. There was a Treaty of Frankfurt which actually cut the provinces from France, and thus in May 1871, the Dreyfuses and their 7 children became subjects now of the German Reichland. But the citizens, because of some peculiarity of the legalities of the time, the citizens around that area could actually claim French citizenship if they wanted to move and to deal with that. But those in the Reichland could not demonstrate, at pain, if not of death, of severe consequences, demonstrate any French allegiance. That came down to speaking the language, flying the flag, singing the songs, or anything else. Alfred Dreyfus was 11 years old at the time. Said he, "My hatred, the hatred of my family for the foreigners," i.e. the Germans, and with the total threat of destruction by the Germans of Mulhouse, the French decided to pay off the Germans and presented them with whatever they wanted. At the same time, in order to just cover their back, they gave whatever they gave to the Germans to the French as well. Now, Alfred, the man, the person, the main personality we're now coming to, and remember his background, Alfred was sent to school in Basel and then Paris. And when he attended a rigorous institution in order to sit the baccalaureate, Alfred was not a very special kid. He was lonely. He missed his home. He missed his brother Mathieu. He had the closest relationship. Those 2 youngest brothers had a very close relationship. They were best friends. He was sickly, and as a Jew, he found it difficult to integrate. But he was a very good student, and he tore himself into studies as a compensation to his inadequacies. He had keen intellect, he had a gift for languages, he had a gift for maths and science, and he passed his exams. And he resisted the temptation that his father wanted him to go into the business. He resisted the temptation that his brother Mathieu wanted him to go into the business. And he decided on a military career. Now, you may think that a military career in the Jewish world was unusual, but at that time, in that place, it was not that unusual. And there were hundreds of Jews who went into the French army, into the officer class, in order to show their allegiance to France. And he dedicated himself, what he said, quote, to the service of the fatherland. And he would love France as advocated by his rabbi. He had an association with the rabbi because France was, as I've already stated, a country which was very desirable, was good and generous. He then applied to the École Polytechnique, a time when the army was now in a state of shock, trying to rebuild itself, rebuild the officer corps. And being wealthy, he could easily pay the fees. There was no problem. They had more money, you could say, than they knew what to do with. He was young, but being in a boarding school was no problem. He'd been developed in a school which was rigorous, authoritative, very disciplined, and so he was used to that. And boys in the École Polytechnique were examined and scrutinized on every aspect of their being. They were watched all the time, how they dressed, how they walked, how they ate, how they talked. And one particular aspect of Dreyfus was noted. is that he had a monotone and a raspy voice. He was completely uninspiring as a person when you were speaking to him. His voice was very poor. Now, religion, according to the authorities in this school, was tolerated. But the religion had to be a service on the altar of the French army. That was the religion. That was the God. That was the thing which they served in. And that would become his driving force of Alfred, with total respect, total belief, and total adherence to the absolute ways of the French army. The army could never be wrong, as it were. Now, Alfred, not only being an extremely good student, although not number one by any means, he was also an expert fencer, and he became an expert on riding horses. And he did that. He said, quoting Dreyfus himself, that he had little aptitude for horse riding, but he wanted to show that Jews could ride horses and they weren't to be judged like everybody else would judge them, that Jews were no good at that sort of thing. When it came to graduation in 1880 from this école, he came 128th. So he was not number one, numero uno in his class, but he was okay to qualify. And he became a second lieutenant. Now, Alfred then decided to choose one particular area which was needed by the French army, which was choose the artillery. And he was therefore able to delve into the intricacies of the use of artillery, as it would be needed in order to, as they saw, their revenge and their fight back against Germany in a situation that would at some time come about. When he was relaxing, he had plenty of money. He had no problem. He didn't really mix with others of the classes which he was with, and he spent money as he could, and he enjoyed it, he said, women, and that did get him into one aspect of the future affair and case was brought up all the time, was his tendency to associate with women. And the army would allow later on people to be involved with women as long as they were discreet and didn't bring the army into disrepute. Now, the report on him said he was very lively, intelligent, he had excellent memory, he was extremely qualified to teach horsemanship, and an ideal candidate now for the École Supérieure de Guerre, of the School of War. And he could work with the general or the army general staff. Then, aged 29, he was promoted as a captain, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, and he was viewed as a leader of men. He studied tactics, topography, German. He traveled around. He saw where the German emplacements were. He knew where the borders were. He saw what was going on. He traveled also back to his home, which was not strictly according to army protocol, but he managed to get through the borders. He knew how to do it. But he was obsessed with work and was a perfectionist, and making him appear, as others said, and they reported it, that he was selfish, insensitive, arrogant, and not particularly liked by officers or his fellow man. So you can see he wasn't the ideal person in so many ways. Now, he befriended another Jewish officer, captain, was Hadamard, and he married one of the sisters, who was Lucy, in 1890. Now, her father was a wealthy diamond dealer, and if you were going to marry, you wanted to marry well. And he came from a wealthy family, and they married into a wealthy family. And every marriage had to be approved by the army. The army had to approve of your marriage. You couldn't just marry anybody at any time as you wished. And this was approved because he was marrying into a good, wealthy family who could well settle and pay for any requirements. Lucy was more religious than Alfred, and although Alfred had not denied his Jewishness, and they were married by the chief rabbi, Rabbi Zadok Khan, unlike Mathieu, who never had a Jewish wedding. And they had a Jewish wedding And Rabbi Zadok said to them under the chuppah that Jews above all feel a love for France without limit. They are proud to defend the flag. Alfred took the exams for the School of War and was accepted. He came 67th out of 81. Not particularly impressive. Lucy and Alfred settled down into Paris, where they lived among the 40,000 Jews. As an officer, he traveled widely, examining fortresses and maps and confronting Germans as he saw. He wanted to be on the general staff, but needed to be near the top of the class. So Lucy his wife recorded how all of his time would be spent studying, but he became an impressive 9th out of 81. And he now became into a position as a probationer of the Army General Staff. At that moment, having come 9th out of 81, Alfred Dreyfus confronts anti-Semitism face to face. Before taking up for his post, he then found out that General Pierre Bernafon did not want a Jew on the general staff. And he, Alfred, and another Jewish officer had their marks lowered as a result of what they perceived as a Jewishness, even if they would say it was because of his personality. He decided to meet with one of the generals, and he asked, "Is a Jewish officer not capable of serving the country as well as any other soldier?" He was reassured and was happy that said that Jewish officers were valued as highly as any others. Dreyfus' belief in the army, as I've said before, was absolutely solid. At that time, there was an increase in racial anti-Semitism, especially by the founder of the Anti-Semitic League of Edouard Dumont, and his newspaper, La Libre Parole, with its cry of France for the French, to challenge the savagery of Jewish invaders and saying that Jews were a nation within a nation, only loyal to what he said was the promised land of Israel. Joined by the Catholic press, Jews were viewed as horse dealers and spies. There were 300 Jewish officers out of 40,000, way above the percentage in the population, which I've already said was less than 1%. In his professional life, Dreyfus elicited admiration and hostility. He was viewed as pretentious with a problematic character. Many of his colleagues read the anti-Semitic La Libre Parole, and it is said that Dreyfus would walk through areas where people were reading it, and he would refer to it as a rag and a display of foolishness, and just, in a way, just dismissed it. Back home, he now had, with Lucy, 2 children, and he wasn't easy to live with. But in their family of wealth and contentment, life was good then, as we end today. Then on Wednesday, October the 31st, 1894, Lucy, the wife of Alfred Dreyfus, sent an urgent telegram to his closest brother, Mathieu, at the Mulhouse Cotton Exchange. And he said, "You must come to Paris immediately." Wednesday, October the 31st, 1894, Lucy Dreyfus sent an urgent telegram to Mathieu at the Mulhouse Cotton Exchange. He must come to Paris immediately. And on that note, we end and continue on from the moment of the receipt of that telegram. I wish you all well. If you have any questions, please, as always, as you do, email me, and we will continue on with the conversation. Thank you very much to all of you.